All right, let's dive into this explainer. How exactly does a pragmatic, domestic tinkerer evolve into the grand strategist of the entire free world? Today, we're tracking the incredible political evolution of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's a fascinating story of ever-expanding scale, rapidly shifting priorities, and really the creation of a blueprint for unprecedented executive power. Now, check out the language he uses right here in his 1932 acceptance speech. He calls it a call to arms. But here's the catch. He wasn't talking about a literal military conflict at all. He was talking about fighting the Great Depression. At this early stage, his focus was entirely domestic. He was literally rallying the nation for an economic war. Which leads us directly to our core question for this explainer. How did a leader whose defining mandate was domestic economic survival suddenly become the architect of a total global war? Well, we're going to trace that exact journey through his ever-expanding scale of leadership. Here's our roadmap for this evolution. We'll start with the progressive aristocrat, move to his crucible and resurgence, explore the domestic experimenter, watch him shifting the focus, analyze the global commander, and finally, contrast those two eras of leadership. Section 1. The Progressive Aristocrat. From Hyde Park to National Politics. The absolute crucial point to understand about his early career is its local scale. Born into incredible wealth, Franklin actually began his political life by driving his own automobile, which was a huge rarity back then, around his heavily Republican New York district just to win a local state Senate seat in 1910. He quickly became this insurgent progressive voice fighting the Tammany Hall machine. And then just 3 years later, Woodrow Wilson appoints him Assistant Secretary of the Navy, giving him his very first vital taste of naval administration. Fast forward to 1920, and he's already on the National Democratic ticket. Moving into Section 2, Crucible and Resurgence, Polio and Empathy. So, in 1921, at age 39, his rapid upward trajectory was completely derailed. An illness, initially diagnosed as polio, permanently paralyzed him from the waist down. He had to laboriously teach himself to walk short distances using these incredibly heavy iron braces. But this physical battle, it became his ultimate political crucible. The guy who was once seen as a somewhat aloof, aristocratic progressive was suddenly forged into a highly relatable, deeply resilient figure. And it was exactly this profound, newfound empathy that fueled his successful run for governor of New York in 1928. Section 3. The Domestic Experimenter. Bold Action in the Depression. By the time he won the presidency in that massive 1932 landslide, the scale of his leadership had to dramatically expand to address the absolute bottom of the Great Depression. I mean, a quarter of the workforce was unemployed, banks were totally shuttered, and Roosevelt responded by becoming the ultimate pragmatic tinkerer. Through the first and second New Deal, he was incredibly hands-on. He was micromanaging domestic legislation, setting up all those alphabet soup agencies to get people immediate relief, and basically laying the entire groundwork for the modern welfare state. And this quote right here perfectly captures his core philosophy at the time. The country demands bold, persistent experimentation. He wasn't strictly bound by some rigid economic ideology, you know? If a program didn't work, well, he'd just drop it and try something else. He was a hands-on manager of domestic survival, running the whole country on this massive trial-and-error approach. Which brings us to Section 4, Shifting the Focus. From domestic policy to global threat. But history, of course, wouldn't let him remain just a domestic tinkerer. As totalitarianism started sweeping across Europe and Asia, the scale of his leadership had to zoom way out. While he was carefully navigating a heavily isolationist American public, Roosevelt conceived this brilliant idea, the arsenal of democracy. Through programs like Lend-Lease, he started leveraging America's massive industrial capacity to supply military aid to nations like Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. And he managed to do all of this without actually declaring war at first. But he also needed to prepare the public mind. Imagine trying to convince a deeply isolationist country to care about a war an entire ocean away. So in 1941, he laid out these 4 fundamental freedoms. This wasn't just some dry policy proposal. It was a passionate philosophical case directed straight at the American public. He was essentially defining exactly what the free world was fighting for, months before the U.S. even officially entered the fight. Section 5. The Global Commander, Architect of the War Effort. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Roosevelt became the commander of a total world conflict. And that created a completely new dynamic. As you can see, war mobilization essentially solved the domestic economic crisis that had defined his entire first two terms. Those millions of unemployed workers, they were suddenly either drafted or completely absorbed into this booming wartime manufacturing sector. And that allowed Roosevelt to shift his executive focus 100% toward global victory. Just look at this number, 300,000. That is the sheer, mind-boggling scale of the military aircraft produced by the U.S. between 1941 and 1945. To put that into perspective, by 1944, U.S. production literally dwarfed the combined output of all Axis and Allied nations put together. Roosevelt was no longer managing domestic public works projects. He was now managing the single greatest industrial war machine in human history. And with this massive new global scale, his management style completely inverted. Remember, as a domestic experimenter, he loved tinkering with every little detail. But as a wartime leader, he evolved into a true grand strategist. He established the Joint Chiefs of Staff and delegated all that tactical military micromanagement entirely to the experts. This was a brilliant move because it freed Roosevelt up to focus on the absolute highest level of geopolitics, conducting direct summit diplomacy with Churchill and Stalin, and pushing hard for a post-war world order centered entirely around establishing the United Nations. Now, we have to talk about how this massive scaling up of executive power brought some profound, permanent consequences. Roosevelt started operating with frankly unprecedented unilateral authority, and this led to some incredibly momentous directives. We're talking everything from authorizing the top-secret Manhattan Project to develop nuclear weapons, all the way to issuing the deeply controversial executive order that forced the internment of Japanese Americans. These actions completely and permanently redefine the limits of presidential power, sparking intense debates that are still going on today. Finally, Section 6, Two Eras of Leadership, the Ultimate Contrast. So here is the complete political evolution we've been tracing in this explainer. On one side, you have the early 1930s pragmatist, hands-on, tinkering with domestic legislation, just constantly experimenting to get people relief. But then, on the other side, you have the 1940s wartime leader, delegating the gritty details, commanding total industrial mobilization, and literally negotiating the fate of the globe from 30,000 feet. The contrast between the local domestic tinkerer and the high-altitude global visionary is absolutely stark. Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't just evolve his own personal political style, he literally evolved the very nature of American executive power. Think about it. From driving his own car to win a local state Senate seat, all the way to commanding the global stage and building the United Nations. So here's the question I want to leave you with. How does the legacy of his unprecedented expansion of power still shape the mechanics, the expectations, and the limits of modern leadership today? It is definitely a fascinating question to ponder. Thanks for diving into this explainer with me.